Thank you everybody for coming. So nice to see all of you here and to welcome our guest, David Dault. He teaches at Loyola in Chicago. He is an award-winning radio host, podcaster, producer, and he's worked with PBS, with NPR. So we're very lucky to have him with us to wrap our heads around how to conceptually produce content and then also the technical stuff as well. And so thank you so much, David, for coming again.
Well, and I'm delighted with the turnout. Thank you all for the trust that you have already shown in me by just showing up. My intention today is to make some remarks we've got about 90 minutes, so my intention is to maybe take about a half an hour with some prepared remarks, and then I'd like to spend the bulk of the conversation talking through things, because when I come into a room like this, what I have learned again and again is that I can't anticipate all the things that you all might be wondering, thinking, all of that. But as Lauren was saying, I have been doing something like public scholarship through the media for the past 15 years, but in softer senses for the past 25 years. And so I hope that what I can do here with the center is take some of that skill set, distill it down into some things that might be able to make you think in different ways about your own scholarship and how it might translate into wider publics and public spheres, and then to give some practical or pragmatic steps for how you might do that. So, there's a professor of nuclear engineering at MIT by the name of Mike Short, and he said something that sticks with me. He says, if someone discovered the neutron and wrote up their discovery and put that piece of paper in a desk, and then they died or the house burned down, was the neutron discovered? And Mike Short's thesis is, no, it wasn't. Because even though that particular individual may have made the discovery, until it became a public form of communication, until it was published or until it was made available to others, it doesn't function as a discovery. And so I'm going to take that as a kind of starting point for my remarks today, because we are very good at taking things, writing them up on pieces of paper, and doing the equivalent of putting them in our desk drawers. And so part of what I'm going to be presenting as a thesis today is that you can take what you are doing and you can find ways to translate it so that it begins to be available for wider publics. And sometimes that means that you're actually going to be moving the needle on some policy issue. Other times it simply means that you're going to be making a wider splash for whatever particular type of thing gets you or your department interested. But either way, these are things that you can be doing and building in, I hope in a sustainable fashion, into your daily work of scholarship. And so at the end of the day, I'm not trying to add extra work to what you're doing. I'm trying to get you to think critically about what you're already doing and to think about ways that it might be able to be translated into a more public form of communication. And so, hence the title, Public Scholarship as Storytelling. So I recognize, and Lauren has told me a little bit about the makeup of the different departments that have come into this room. It seems like there's 12 different departments stretched across the humanities, which is wonderful. But I'm going to ask, in any of your preparations to get to this room, have any of you been on trajectories that have required you at any point to engage with a scientific paper? Yeah, okay. When you read a scientific paper, can you walk us through what that process is like?
There's a very clear abstract at first, then the introduction. Everything is very structured, much more than what we write. They start with a very strong thesis, then they have the developer to explain their method and their finding, and then they just analyze what they did.
Absolutely. Now let me ask you a follow-on question. When you sit down to read a scientific paper, do you start at the first word and end at the last word, or is there a strategy for navigating a scientific paper that's different from just reading beginning to end?
I usually do a beginning and end, and then if I'm interested in how they found the end, I go through the paper.
Yes, so you begin at the end, and then if something is interesting at the end, you read the rest. Okay, that's my point, and that's what I wanted us to get here. So a scientific paper is a form of communication, but it's a highly specialized form of communication, right? It's not a form of communication that necessarily is designed to be read from beginning to end. Like, you'd have to be a particular type of perverse thinker to think that's the way that you're supposed to engage with a scientific paper. Instead, you start with the stuff that you think is going to be most important, either the abstract or the conclusion, and then if you need to know more, you dig into the rest of it. Okay, so I've put up on our screen a line, and on one end of the line, at the kind of extreme left end, I put scientific paper. Okay. I imagine that many of you, because of your humanities backgrounds, have had the experience of engaging with a poem before. Anybody here done any kind of literary criticism of poetry and care to walk us through what that is like? When you approach a poem, how do you approach a poem?
Usually word by word and line by line, paying attention to what resonances or references the words might be making, similes, double entendres, and then usually circling back after you've done some lines to see if there's like a shift in there.
So what I love about this, so it's recursive, it's iterative, it's looping approaches, and so as it's like Dilthey is here with this whole hermeneutic circle. So you're looking at the small pieces, getting the bigger pieces, going back to the small pieces. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so what I want you to be getting out of this line here on the wall is that at one extreme end is a scientific paper. A scientific paper is a very highly specialized and technical form of communication for a very particular type of audience, usually one that has been trained how to read the paper. As has been said by our friend over here, start at the end, and if it's interesting, work backwards. At the other end of the extreme, on the right end, is a poem. And a poem is another kind of highly specialized communication, which, as has just been demonstrated, you don't necessarily read as an entire unit, but rather you are moving through it in a hermeneutic fashion, trying to build an idea of how you are to understand it. Okay, so two different types of highly specialized communication. But if we are to go out into the world, most of the people that you are going to encounter in the world are not trained or even equipped to engage with these kinds of communications. Most people that you will encounter if you walk here, even on the streets of Princeton, are not people who are regularly engaging with scientific papers or regularly engaging with poems in the way that this is being talked about here. Would that it were different, but that's the way that it is. So that leaves us then with something here in the middle. Between the two poles, the vast majority of the way that people communicate and expect to be communicated with is through a particular type of communication which we could call narrative. Basically, the majority of communication in our culture right now is a form of storytelling. And so, if we want to take what we are doing, our various types of research, and we are wanting to make it more available to wider audiences, the audiences that we would hope to reach are going to be audiences that are not trained in the reading of scientific papers, not trained in the reading of poetry, but rather they are trained from a very young age, God bless you, trained from a very young age in the engagement with narrative. From your earliest days in elementary school, from preschool even, you're trained about how stories work. And so that's what they're going to be expecting. And so part of what I'm hoping to do today is to try and describe how you can be thinking about your work in a way that can be translated into a narrative. Okay. Why? I've got three main reasons why I think this is important. First, unlike scientific papers and poetry, as I just said, just about everyone you might want to talk to has been habituated into narrative. From a very young age, we're all trained on the basics of how stories work through countless repetitions. Okay? The second reason is that stories, narrative, is hardwired into our emotions. When a story is told well, it engages not only the head, but the heart, which means that if you are interested in a policy outcome of your research, or if you're interested in some sort of wider social impact of your conclusion, having a way to access the emotions of an audience can be a useful way of amplifying that in the public sphere. And third, because stories in our culture share a common structure. And because we're all trained to respond to them through this endless repetition of learning, narrative is a very efficient way of communication. If you learn to leverage narrative structure, the structure can do a lot of the heavy lifting in your communication efforts. In other words, you don't have to reinvent this wheel. Okay. So there are so many approaches to narrative structure and to analyzing narrative structure. You may, for example, have heard of Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. The Star Wars original trilogy was based around the hero's journey. Or if you're a fan of comedy like I am and you like shows like Community or Rick and Morty, you may have heard that Dan Harmon, the creator of those shows, has an analysis of story structure called the story circle. Or you may have taken a film theory class, in which case you were introduced to the 3-act structure, the 5-act structure, and the 7-act structure of film analysis. So all of those are ways of breaking down narrative structure, and all of those can be good and useful, but today I want to keep it very simple. I've studied all of them, and they're all good, and you can nerd out about them. But for our purposes today, I'm gonna keep it simple, and I'm gonna just talk about 3 steps. All right. So already, we've begun to create a little bit of intrigue. Why these ingredients? What could possibly be awaiting us? What are these ingredients? We may even invite people to come and to stick your finger in it. Ooh, it's salt. Ooh, okay. And they hit, that's bland. It's flour. Okay. And up here, that's milk and that's flour and that's sugar and that's salt. Okay, so you're kind of dipping your fingers in and you're sort of okay, well, but one of the things that's important here is that from this point there's a lot of places we could go, right? We have no idea what's going to happen next, and also right now there's really not much happening. Everything is in its own isolated little space. It's really not interacting or anything. Okay, and as long as we can keep it in this space indefinitely, but it's not very tasty and it's pretty boring. Okay, so in order to move from this kind of segmented, isolated, individuated space where everything is in its own little happy container, into a space where something more interesting is happening, we have to have what our media theorists call an inciting event. And in this particular case, the inciting event that I want to suggest is we break an egg. Now, what's important about breaking an egg is it's an event that once it is done, it can't be undone. It is a decisive moment where something has changed in the balance of these individuated elements. Something has begun to have momentum, and you can't move backwards from it. It's a barrier moment. Okay, so again, in narrative theory, we would call this the inciting event. Okay, something happens that once it has happened, you can't go back. You cannot go from here back to the place where everything had its own little polite, individuated space. All right, but still from here, these ingredients could become a lot of different things. Okay, and so what matters then is once this event has happened, once you've crossed the barrier that you can't come back from, then you need to begin to introduce some agitation, some mixing of those individuated elements, and you may need to add some friction, and everybody knows that friction leads to heat. And as this begins to build and build, the elements begin to be less individuated, and not just the egg, but now other things begin to be transformed and intermixed. And again, things are happening that can't be undone until eventually you have a result. Okay? And that result is the result of having made a decisive break event that can't be undone, and then applying greater momentum, pressure, and friction to the elements until something is transformed, and now it's all the same elements that you had at the beginning. Like all of these things are still there. But as a result of the process, you can no longer get back to this state. You have a new state that has been introduced. So, the way that I want to talk about storytelling today is 3 simple elements. Make the world, break the world, and bake the world. And I'm going to unpack what each of these means. So, when we make the world, We're establishing the baseline. And again, forgive the word, but in media studies, we would call this the normal. All right? Anybody here seen Guardians of the Galaxy, the most recent one, Guardians of the Galaxy 3? Okay. What I love about Guardians of the Galaxy 3 is that they establish the normal in the first 7 minutes. Everybody's happy, they're hanging out, there's harmony. The Guardians of the Galaxy aren't fighting with one another, they're all getting along, except Peter Quill is drunk and sad, but everything else. But within the first 7 minutes, they've established this is what the normal looks like. And then at the 7-minute point, they break the world. A meteor crashes in, something happens, and then suddenly they're off and running. But it's the most efficient normalization establishment I've ever seen in a film. Usually it takes half an hour to 45 minutes to establish the normal in most filmic narratives. But here they get it established and they immediately get out of the way. Then they spend the rest of the 2.5 hours explaining how they get back to something new from the breaking of the normal. But you can't create a tension if you don't first have a relaxation. So you start from a point where things are relatively calm and understandable. Now, if we were talking about fiction, if you're introducing a fantasy story, the normal, or establishing the normal, is where you help the people understand how the mechanics of the world work. Okay, this is a world where gravity works like gravity works in our world, only you can also wave sticks and say Latin, and things will transform from apples into albatrosses. Okay, so that's establishing the normal of a world. Does it look like our world? What's the same? What's different? So that the viewer, the reader, whoever, has a sense of kind of what is expected and what would be out of the norm. Once the normal is established, once you have created that space of kind of expectation, the baseline is there, then if you just keep telling that story, bless you, nothing is going to be exciting. There's no reason for, in a world full of noise, there's no reason for a person to stay tuned into this particular program. Okay, so as soon as you have established that world and you have a sense of the comfort for the audience to know what to expect and what not to expect, that's when you want to break the world. That's when the eggs are broken. You have some kind of inciting event that begins to move things forward. All right? I can't go back. Harry Potter gets on the train and finds out that he's a wizard, gets on the train, and then the world is different. And even if he were to go back to the closet, he would go back to the closet with a different sense of the world and a bigger world, like his normal has been broken. Okay? And most of the story happens after the breaking of the world in what I would call baking the new world, or baking the world. So we are putting this broken expectation into a series of frictions, into a series of clashes. One particular party wants one thing, another particular party wants another thing. And it's that churning, that friction, that heat, that at the end of the story, at the end of the narrative, yields something different. Everybody may go back to where they ended up living before, but they go back changed. They go back transformed. All the elements may still be there, just like they're all still there in the cake, but they don't look the same. They don't taste the same. When you dip your finger into it, you don't get just the salt anymore. So this kind of mixture, this kind of process, we can get more detailed or less detailed about it, but that fundamentally is what I want you to be thinking about when you're thinking about your work. And you might be saying, okay, hold on. I study a remote culture in West Africa, or I study the behavior of a particular group of nomadic Europeans in the 14th century, or I study, could be like, how do you turn this into this, Dault? Okay. Again, I'm going to stay very simple. Think about natural tension points. Think about ways in which, and forgive the language, it's simplified language. Think about who might be the hero in your research. Who might be the antagonist in your research. The protagonist, the antagonist. And simply, protagonist and antagonist, and I'm trying to stay away from hero and villain. Protagonist and antagonist just mean two different forces that want to see different things. All right? Let me give a very concrete example. Here on the table you see some cards from my radio show, Things Not Seen. 11 years ago, when I first started Things Not Seen, I thought it would be a great idea to try and get some sponsors. And at the time, I was in Memphis, Tennessee. And so I went around to various possible sponsors, one of whom was a religious bookstore. And the religious bookstore said, "This is great, we want to sponsor you." Fantastic. And so I went and I drew up the contract to get the sponsorship together. And in between me saying yes, or in between them saying yes, they wanted to sponsor me, and me drawing up the contract, I put out an episode with a scholar and friend of mine by the name of Tim Beale. And the name of the episode, because this was Tim Beale's scholarship at the time, he had just come out with a book on the Bible, and he had said a really evocative phrase in our interview. He said, "The Bible doesn't exist." I loved that phrase, and so I made that the title of the episode. And I went back to the religious bookstore, and they said, "Well, I looked at your website, and you have an episode called The Bible Doesn't Exist. We're not going to be a sponsor for your show." Now, at the time, I had raised enough money to produce one season, 13 episodes of the show, and radio sometimes can be a pay-to-play kind of thing, so I was trying to raise money for the next season. I needed that sponsorship. And so I was very frustrated, and what did I do? Well, at the time, this was the beginning of things like GoFundMe and those kind of crowdsourcing. Patreon hadn't come on the scene yet, but so I decided, okay, what if I were to make something like a GoFundMe campaign to try and raise the money to get this next season on the air? And so I was like, all right, how would I pitch this as a narrative? And I thought, this establishment that has just said that they don't want to be sponsors of my show, they've given me the greatest gift in the world.
You're the bad guy.
They've given me a bad guy. Yeah, and so I was able then, and I didn't ever name the store, but being able to say, I want to tell and have a certain kind of conversation about religion in the public sphere. And not everybody wants me to have that kind of conversation. And I in Précis form said we had lined up a sponsor to help us get this next season made so that we can continue these kinds of conversations. But then the sponsor didn't like what we were saying and said that they weren't going to fund us. Would you help to make up the gap? Raised $10,000. Okay? Because having that kind of structure can be an incredibly powerful leverage point, because it engages not just, yeah, I want to have conversations like this in the world, but now the people can get involved like on a ball team, right? I'm Team Dault. I want to help these. And so that is one particular and very rough-edged example of what I'm trying to say here. Now, in your research, you may not want to take a particular side and say, this is the bad guy. I'm not saying that's always what you have to do. But you can find things in your research that form natural obstacles. Okay? Things in your research that are either for the people that you're studying or for your own work that form obstacle points. And you can find ways to leverage your storytelling so that the people that are following along with you get invested in the success of overcoming that obstacle. Sometimes when let's say you're studying the building of a cathedral in the 16th century, and the cathedral is, they want to work on it and all, but it's hard to get the labor and it's hard to get the resources. All of those natural obstacles can become fulcrum points where you can begin to invest people in, will they do it? Is it possible? And so that is a way to begin to get people interested in what is a very technical and very abstruse piece of research. One of the best examples of that kind of storytelling that I've seen is a PBS documentary called Building the Great Cathedrals, where all through they're showing you the very technical, nerdy parts of how the cathedrals are made, but they wrap them in mysteries. this cathedral is 144 feet high. Why did they pick that number? And in solving that problem, they're telling you all the things, the ways in which the architects went back into Holy Scripture, the ways in which the difference between a royal foot and a Roman foot, you know what I'm talking about. That all of this can be ways of grabbing people, and it pulls you along through the hour, and at the end of the hour, you've learned a lot about architecture. You know the difference between a Roman arch and a Gothic arch. But man, nobody wants to listen to that lecture. But you realize you listened and you learned. After watching the great cathedrals with my two little kids, we would walk around. I live right next to the University of Chicago. There's a lot of Roman arches and Gothic arches. I would point at things and say, which is it? At the time, my 7-year-old would say, Gothic arch. So this is the power that you can unlock because they got involved in the mystery. They got interested in the bigger part of the story. Another example from my kids is my kids are learning math, and there are multiple accessories, different apps that are used by the public schools to try and help them learn math. One is called IXL, it just drills them on problems. Another one is called Prodigy, and it is literally a Dungeon and Dragons kind of thing where you become a character and you're fighting against wizards, but the way that you cast spells is you solve math problems. And my kids learned a lot of math from Prodigy, and they resisted learning math from IXL. Because they got involved in the story, you were able to freight these bigger pieces, these more technical pieces in. Nobody simply wants to sit down and take a teaspoon of salt and then a teaspoon of flour and then a teaspoon of oil and a teaspoon of butter and a teaspoon of milk, maybe the milk. But for the most part, people don't want to take these things in the kind of bite-sized, organized chunks that we're so good at doing here in the academy. They want the taste of the cake. And that's part of what we're trying to do here. Okay, now, I'm intentionally going to keep this short so that we can begin to talk about pragmatics here. But, okay, this sounds really good, Dault. But how do we actually put it into practice? Well, it is tough because, as Ira Glass says, when you're trying to tell a story, the story wants to suck. The story will fight you. And so you need sometimes to really work with the material to find the angle that is actually going to resonate with an audience. And that means you're actually aware of who your audience is, who you're trying to talk to. Great example of this, when I was first doing communications consulting, a person came to me, they were a lawyer, and they said, I want to do a law podcast. And I said, great, who's your audience? And she said, everybody. I said, that's a problem. So if you know who you're talking to, you can actually begin to think about the things that would motivate and animate that particular audience towards a particular goal or end. As the motivational speaker Zig Ziglar once said, you can't hit a target you don't aim at. Two brief anecdotes about this. President Lincoln used to steal out of the White House on a Sunday and go down the street to the Presbyterian church and sit in a little antechamber so that he could listen to the sermon. And one day he's coming back, and the story goes, his secretary who is accompanying him asks him, what did you think of the sermon? And President Lincoln said, it was a good sermon. And the secretary asks, a good sermon, not a great sermon, sir? And President Lincoln says, it was not a great sermon because it failed to ask anything great of the audience. Now let's take that little anecdote and let's put it into a real practical effect about storytelling. On the table here, this little card for the Francis Effect. I produced the Francis Effect with Heidi Schlumpf, who's a reporter for National Catholic Reporter, and Dan Horan, who's a Franciscan friar and priest. So I have a good friend who's a Franciscan priest. And my good friend Dan, the Franciscan priest, really loves Pod Save America. Perhaps you've heard of this podcast. And so in the first couple of years of us producing the Francis Effect, at one point he says, hey, David, Pod Save America is going to be doing a live taping down at the Chicago Theater. You want to come? I said, sure. And so we decided to go down there. And so we drove down to downtown Chicago, and we got there a little early because we were going to have dinner. So we went to the restaurant near the Chicago Theater, and we look around the restaurant, and all around the restaurant, people in yellow t-shirts saying, Pod Save America. Okay? And then we go to the theater. And the Chicago Theater is a 1,700-seat theater, and it was at capacity. It was sold out, which means that we looked all around the theater, and Everywhere look at all these people that love lefty politics like we love lefty politics. We're in our crowd. This is great. And they're all wearing Positive American t-shirts. We didn't, I didn't have one. But there were a lot of people there who were visibly involved. And then we watched this show, right? And this show was wonderful because these people, everyone was laughing, and we got to see how the sausage was made. And it was just an amazing sort of event of good analysis and humor and all that. So we got what we paid for. And then, as we were leaving the theater, at every exit, there were between 5 and 10 people standing at the exit with clipboards, registering people to vote. Now think about that for a second. It wasn't simply that we were there to be entertained. It wasn't simply that we were there to reinforce that we were part of a larger crowd. It wasn't simply that we were all on brand as good lefty progressives, but rather we had seen that we had numbers. We had seen that we were all on the same message. And all of that reinforced then the ask of something greater. Now that you have seen that there's more than just you, will you participate in moving the needle? We have the numbers, we filled the theater. Will you do your part? And the first step is making sure you're registered. So they weren't simply producing a program, they weren't simply telling a story, but they were framing the story in terms of asking something greater. And so part of telling the story, and part of what sucks about telling the story, is you don't always know what you want to ask. You don't always know what is the policy position that you hope will be the outcome of your particular research. You don't always know what constitutes the moving of the needle. Is it just having more viewers? Is it just people giving you money? Or is there something different, something less tangible? For me, for Things Not Seen, nobody listens to Things Not Seen. Why do I make Things Not Seen? I make Things Not Seen because Terry Gross of Fresh Air sucks. Let me explain. So, about 11 years ago, Terry Gross was interviewing an anthropologist by the name of T.M. Lerman, Tanya Lerman. And Tanya Lerman had just written a book called Coffee with Jesus, about people who sit down and have imaginary conversations with their Lord and Savior, and they do it with tangible items like they set out cake for Jesus and coffee for Jesus, and they also, and at one point in the conversation, Terry Gross said to Dr. Lerman, when a child has imaginary friends, eventually you tell the child to give up their imaginary friends. Didn't you feel a responsibility, I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty much this, didn't you feel a responsibility to tell these people to give up their imaginary friend? That was the moment when Things Not Seen got started. Because I wanted to create a show that had the same production quality as Fresh Air, that could sit alongside Fresh Air and National Public Radio, but would take seriously the religious reality that people were living. Not in an evangelical way, not trying to convert people, but just being able to take seriously sitting across from them in a way that Terry Gross wasn't able to. And to me, that's still my needle of success. If I'm able every week to put out a show that meets that benchmark, where I have given hospitality to the final vocabulary of another person, I have created something that I think is of value. And sometimes it sucks to get there. Sometimes it's work to get there. But after 10 years of doing it, that still is my particular measure of success. Not the number of listeners, not the amount of sponsors. Those have all stayed pretty steady. Other shows that I've done have had better metrics on those fronts. But for me, my particular measure of success is that the conversation is able to keep going. And I'm able to continue to put this out there into a media sphere where, for the most part, religion is either used as a battle axe or it's completely ignored. All right, so the story wants to suck, the story wants to fight you, and so how do we get started telling stories? Well, again, from Ira Glass talks about the storytelling techniques that he learned when he was beginning to be an editor at National Public Radio, and he puts it very simply. He says, basically, if you want to tell a story, you start out by doing this. You say, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then you take a beat, and you step back and you say, and here's what it means. Now this is where you as academics, this is where you shine. Because you're very good at doing exactly this. But now I want to challenge you to think about who you're doing it with and who you're doing it for. Because yes, absolutely, keep doing it in your journals so that you're talking to your colleagues. but also think about turning outward and helping people who maybe not be trained or may not have the access that you have to the kind of education that you've had, to help walk them through this process. This happened, then this happened, here's what it means. And if you really want to build and engage that audience, ask them what they think as well, and incorporate that back into how you tell the story the next time. Okay, so those are my prepared remarks. I've talked for about 40 minutes, which means we still have a close to an hour to keep going here. I'm going to share this deck with Lauren. I have put some resources on the deck, so when it's shared with you, these are clickable links and also things that you can go and look at. You don't have to write this down now, but that's me, and that's how you can find me, and my cards are on the table, and now I am completely open for questions, observations, jokes. Thank you. Yes?
Sorry, can you just tell us what you mean more by why does the story want to suck and what happens to make it suck?
Okay.
What happens to not?
Sure, but what does that mean and how you, yeah.
It's a good question. Let me give you a concrete example. So at one point, when I first moved to Chicago, and I was not back in academia, I was working as the executive director of a faith-focused media ministry, and we were producing independent documentaries for public broadcasting. And we were trying to think about, again, how do we move the needle from a faith focus, and so we were doing very topical issues from a faith angle. And so we were talking about the kind of broken immigration system. And so we interviewed a bunch of people who are involved in immigration law, who were able to give us the sound bites of everybody says get in line, but there is no line, and we're able to talk about that aspect of it. And we were talking about people who were involved in immigration ministry, who, when documented or undocumented persons came to America, how they were supported by different religious communities and different religious affiliated organizations. So we had that angle. But we really wanted the emotional angle. We wanted to tell the story of a particular family that had been really impacted by the broken immigration policies of America. And so we picked a family that lives in the west suburbs of Chicago. The wife was born in America, the husband was born in Mexico and had been brought as a child undocumented to America and had grown up as an undocumented person in America, met Amy, they fell in love, and they got married and they had kids. And then at that point they decided that they wanted to try and get citizenship for the husband. And that was when the immigration system kicked in and the husband was deported back to Mexico. And so for the last 11 years, Amy and Carlos had been working to try and get back together. And at one point they had lived abroad in Europe together, but they weren't able to have the kind of funding and support because all their family was in America and they were from working class backgrounds. And so the real goal was to try and live together in America. Okay, so this is the setup, right? And so the emotional arc of this is, will Amy and Carlos be able to get back together? And we're walking them through the most recent round of their attempts to do this. They're putting in the paperwork and all this. So as we're having all of these different pieces there, talking about the technical side and the legal side and the support side, we're telling this narrative as well. And so I paid to send a camera crew to go down to Mexico to interview Carlos. And the crew comes back with the film. That's great, and I'm going over the film, and I realize that the most important pieces of their story, he didn't say. And so now I'm faced with a dilemma. Because my crew asked the questions that I asked them to ask, but we didn't anticipate the questions that we really needed to fill in the gaps so that the story would really be clear to the viewer. Carlos knows his story, Amy knows her story, and so they didn't think that they needed to tell those parts. And we didn't know that we needed to ask them. So sometimes in the process of trying to gather the materials of the story, that's one place where the story can suck. Other times, and Ira Glass in the links that I shared, he talks about this, where on This American Life, they will sometimes work and rework to try and get the emotional beats in the right place, because the emotional beats oftentimes are elusive. There's either too much to tell or there's too little to tell. Now, let me come back to Divided Families, that documentary that I worked on. So what became my measure of success for Divided Families? How did I know when we had told the story right? We did screenings all over Chicago at public libraries and other places in a couple different versions of that film. We got to the point where we were 4/5 of the way through telling the story, and we had just gotten word that Amy and Carlos, their most recent attempt, had failed. And so after telling this story for most of, and getting the audience involved, there comes a point where we go to what's called a black title screen, where it's just black with white, and it's Amy and Carlos have made their most recent attempt to be reunited. That's the first. The second was, it failed. The third, they will keep fighting. When I would show this in libraries, I would listen for that moment. And when I knew that we had told the story right was when they got to that second title card, it failed, and I could hear the audible gasp from the audience. Because that meant that they had gotten invested enough that now I could ask them for something greater. And then the last fifth of the story that we told in that documentary was how the audience could get involved in helping families like Amy and Carlos. What concrete things they could do. But it doesn't make sense to ask them to do that unless you know that they're on the hook. But it took so much work once we realized that we didn't have the pieces that we needed. My staff and I, around a big table like this, with big whiteboards like this, we worked and reworked the footage that we had. We worked and reworked what we could bring in that we didn't already have to try and find the way to arrange the pieces so that we could get to that point that we knew that we needed to get to, but we didn't have it in the can when we started. So that's the way that a story can fight you, and you have to fight back, because if you know your audience and you know what you're wanting to ask from your audience, you know when you're at that point how you want them to gasp. Yes?
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk.
Thank
I
you.
enjoyed it so much. At some point I could feel my heart rate increasing, which is, yeah, definitely a sign. So I have two questions. My first question is about, I really love the individual ingredients and things. And well, I come from the history department, which means that in my case, when I start baking the cake, I don't know what the ingredients would be, or I know the first ingredient, right? I did my research, I have an idea, I have an egg, right? And I think I will end up with a cake, but then the next thing, I go back to the archive and the next thing I have is an anchovy or something like that, right? So I wonder, how do we go about this, like the unpredictability of the ingredient? And it's not necessarily that I can reach out for a different ingredient and say that this doesn't work for me, let me try something else, right? So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
What a good question. And so again, that's so when you're telling a fictional story, you can write the script any way that you wish because you're in complete control. When you're doing more documentary work, and so the story for PBS that I was telling was the archival story that you're telling, you don't have control over all of the variables in that. Okay, so how then can you get someone invested in this? Well, sometimes you go meta and you make the archive the opponent. I needed this, and the archive instead gave me this. I needed an egg, and I got an anchovy. And what can you help an audience understand about that? Well, that history is messy. Most people in the public sphere, when they get history as this kind of easily assembled set of parts that just seems to tell a clear story, and it usually involves a king, and the king solves everything. But what you're showing them is that first of all, the process of getting to the facts can sometimes be a process in which there are obstacles. And then once you get the facts, sometimes the facts don't cooperate with what you thought that you were doing. Okay, so you can have a protagonist-antagonist dynamic even with the process itself, and even from that you can have an educative moment. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to assemble a narrative out of your anchovies. But sometimes the failure of a narrative can be a narrative. A great example of this is the Charlie Kaufman film Adaptation, which is a film about his failure to adapt the book that he was hired to adapt. But he ends up making a 2.5-hour movie out of his failure. And he does it by going meta and getting the audience involved not in the main story, but in the attempt to tell the story and all the things that the fictional Charlie Kaufman as a character in the film had to overcome in order to tell the story. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really great. It resonates really with me what you said. I'm a fifth-year Ph.D. student in the Spanish department, and I'm currently getting ready for the job market. So
Yeah.
my writing sample is not only fighting me, it declared war on me.
I feel you. I feel
And
you.
it really sucks. It's not like trying to suck, it's succeeding.
Yes.
And this can be happening because this is a really good year for my field. And I know I'm at a stage where I'm like overthinking. And I was wondering if, because I hate that this happened and this happened, and here's what it means. Because I'm bored with my own writing, which is, I think, the worst thing. Because if you don't like your own writing, who else will?
Yeah.
And even though I know the story, it's a fascinating story, I'm wondering if maybe what you're telling here would also work for academic writing. Still having the information, but maybe having some sort of thread that goes through the chapter and helps you put in like all the details and maybe make it a little bit more bearable for everyone, because that way you'll know where you're getting.
Yeah.
Because I know that now my cake would be the fact that my child star, I'm working on child stars in Spain, did not make it past the transition to democracy because he was associated with the dictatorship. So there's this failed story. It's well known, but maybe using not only the facts and the ingredients, which are the films, the music, the clippings, but actually like his life story as well as a human being would make the whole thing more digestible.
Let me say yes and. See, I come from Chicago. It's an improv city, so we say yes and to things. Okay, so I would say yes and adding in the narrative of this character, this hero, as you said. But it also, as you're thinking about reshaping the writing, there may be a place where your own particular struggle with the job market and those other pieces is a thread through this as well, where that can be a part of the way that the reader gets invested with this as well, because the reader wants you to succeed as a character as well as this other character. And forgive me for a second, anybody here read Derrida much? The best example of what I'm talking about here is a book by Derrida called Limited Ink. In Limited Ink, Derrida sets up an oppositional relationship between himself and John Searle. John Searle is the antagonist and Derrida is the protagonist. And Derrida's whole job in Limited Ink is to get you rooting for his version of what Austin was saying. But he does it through all these kind of ways of getting you involved in the personality of John Searle and the personality of Derrida. My favorite moment in Limited Ink is where Searle has challenged Derrida to just be serious for a moment. And Derrida says, "I will be serious, sir. In fact, I am now raising my hand over the keyboard and swearing that I will be serious from this moment on." But that's, when I reach that moment, and I've reread Limited Ink a number of times because of this, when I reach that moment, I whoop with joy. Because I'm invested not just in the stupid, abstract, linguistic philosophy that's there, but I'm invested in the way that this is told as a story. So there are ways that you can begin to bring that kind of personality into writing, maybe not as flamboyantly as Derrida does. But in a way that can get your readers whooping with joy or weeping with sympathy. So there are things about the struggle, because this person was associated with fascism, and maybe they were associated with fascism just because they were a child and all that. Yeah, and so they had no agency in it, and yet they were affected by it. Well, that's a heartbreaking situation. Yeah. And so if you can help your reader to feel the heartbreak of it, that can be a way of getting them involved in this.
Can I propose something? Maybe this isn't really an answer to the question, but another question that sort of would help is, could we think of the previous scholarship as our antagonist, or the state of the field?
Lord, sometimes I do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you think, that is to say, what you're bringing is, the author is the hero a little bit, to counter and I think that is the energizing motivation of a lot of academic writing. Is you set up the previous scholarship or a particular perspective as the opponent, and then you say, well, here's the reasons that those are wrong, but we give the ending away right at the very beginning. So one of the questions is, can you make a distinction between that structure and a narrative structure?
I think that is a narrative structure. And so one of the most important and helpful ways to get an audience involved in a particular story is to have a sympathetic antagonist, where it's not simply that the antagonist is the equivalent of a mustache twiddling kind of villain, but rather you actually understand that the scholarship came about because they thought that this was the right way to do this, and now we have learned some things that help us to understand that there's a different way that we need to push back against that. But there are forces from that earlier sedimentation of scholarship that make this very difficult. And so how can we overcome those, the entire arc of the Star Wars prequels and sequels and whatever it is about the redemption of Anakin Skywalker. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to see Darth Vader die with no meaning, you want to see Darth Vader dying redeemed by Luke Skywalker. A sympathetic antagonist can drive an entire narrative arc. So find the things in your obstacle that make the obstacle sympathetic. And that can create even more, because that creates tension in the audience as well.
Yeah, like which way is it gonna go?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, forgive me for using Harry Potter, but that's where my kids were for a number of years, and so I know those narratives. And so Severus Snape is a villain in the beginning of the story. By the end of the story, he's a sympathetic obstacle. And when you finally find the entirety of his story, you are heartbroken, even though you hate the son of a bitch. Okay, that's powerful storytelling, when you can be heartbroken over somebody that you despise. And maybe some of you have some scholars that you feel about that way about, that's, yes?
Thank you so much. It was such a great talk. So my first very brief question is, can you please go back to the resource slide?
Yeah.
Just while you're talking, I'd like to see this. And then my second question is, I really am inspired by these images and visuals of creatives in a room with whiteboards around them, scribbling, and I'm trying to do that for myself. And at the end of the day, I just come up with a normal outline with thesis, 5 paragraphs on the computer. So I would love to learn more about what is happening in these brainstorming sessions.
Yeah.
Is it that I need to keep in mind a certain genre and I'm identifying an antagonist, protagonist? How are you brainstorming what the emotional beat will be? How are you thinking about how the frames move from one to another in a way that challenges you to think outside the narrative structure that we learned in 2nd grade?
Such a good question. So the third down up there, why the 3-act structure matters, that's a little over an hour of two people who have done a lot of deep diving, talking about how you get the emotional beats in the right place. Yeah, so if the lightsaber fight between Luke and Darth Vader happened in the first movie, you would not have the same emotional payoff. So having things be in certain places is important. And as I talked about filmic structure and the 3-act structure, the 5-act structure, and the 7-act structure, those slices of analysis, think about the kind of story beats in increasingly fine-grained orders. And so for filmic structure, you set up the world in the first act. You break the world at the entrance into the second act. And then most of the second act, if you read film analysis, most of the second act is what the film theorists call fun and games. Where you're playing with the new world that you're in, and you have some scenes that are there to move the story along, but some scenes are just there to play with the world. But along the way, you're setting up those scenes. Every scene is building towards a kind of climax point where they think that they've solved the problem that gets them back to the world that they wanted to get to. But they don't. And then everything goes into the darkest pit possible. And then the third act is getting out of that pit towards the actual conclusion. So, I hate to say it, but if you watch a religious film like The Mission, and you watch a religious film like The Exorcist, and you watch a religious film like Boondock Saints, and you watch a religious film like The Passion of Joan of Arc, and you watch them in parallel, and I've done this with classes, you begin to realize that they are telling the same story with the same beats, with the same elements. In the mission, there's a talismanic object, the cross that is worn by one of the Jesuits that eventually gets passed to one of the indigenous people. In the Passion of Joan of Arc, it is the ring that Antonin Artaud gives to Joan of Arc. In The Exorcist, it is the cross that is worn by the Jesuit at the end, and when the girl who has been released from the demonic possession sees the cross, she hugs the priest, because that's the same cross that Father Damien was wearing. And when it's Boondock Saints, it's the guns. Okay, so, but in each of these cases, you have different story content that is told with the same kind of 7-act emotional beats where there's the build-up and so the thing that is both wonderful and heartbreaking about this kind of approach to narrative is you realize that we're so trained in this kind of narrative that if you look at it structurally, there's very little originality in the way that we tell stories to ourselves. We skin the characters differently, and we skin the situations differently, but the beats are mostly the same. And it takes a very original and generative thinker, someone like maybe David Fincher, the director, who can take that structure and rearrange it in a way that is still satisfying to us, because we're so used to having the beats in the right place that when the beats are out of place, it feels wrong, and the story doesn't work. And we've all seen movies where the story doesn't work, all right? And so I guess part of what I'm trying to say is that for people in media studies, the resources are replete in how to begin to put these pieces in the right order. We don't study that in the academy. We study the 5-paragraph structure, we study the abstract methods, conclusion, hypothesis structure. We don't necessarily study the structure of how to get people emotionally involved in our scholarship. But if you start with these, it's going to help you to begin to be able to spot how the beats move one to another. I studied with Walter Brueggemann in seminary. In Walter Brueggemann's scholarship, when he reads the Psalms, he says there's orientation, there's disorientation, and there's reorientation. That's fundamentally what we're doing. You get a person oriented to something, and then you introduce an idea that's going to really knock them on their feet, and then you help them incorporate that new idea. That's good teaching, that's good writing. That's what we're trying to do here, but that is a very emotional interaction with your reading audience. And so if you can begin to figure out, what can I put in my writing that will help them feel oriented? What can I put in my writing that will then take that orientation and upset it in some way, but without damaging them or doing violence to them, but rather allowing them to reincorporate this new thing so that they have greater understanding at the end? That's the kind of dynamic that we're talking about. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to follow with 2 quick comments.
Yeah, please.
So the first being that I love how you pitched this as a way to take our scholarship and make it public.
Yes.
But I'm seeing this as very relevant to my academic scholarship as well. In the best example being that this would make a great job talk. A 3 to 7 act structure of your academic journey, put it into a job talk, I'd be sold.
Yeah.
And as someone in a department that's done a search every year I've been here, it would have really helped a lot of these candidates.
There you go. Yeah.
That's my first comment. And then the second comment is, I don't know what you make of this, but the closest way I'm in anthropology, and the closest thing I've come to see in anthropological work that breaks the 5-paragraph narrative structure with thesis statement, evidence, conclusion, is when the author is asking a rhetorical question and then she answers her question. So she's taking the reader on her journey. It's a way of breaking the thing. It's still not very engaging, but Spivak does it really well. Some people do it really well. I just wanted to know what you think of that, which narrative, if at all, structure it fits into.
First of all, I think that your suggestion that academics could think about this in their own professional development is well taken, and I think it would be a very powerful resource for just about anybody to think about how they're presenting their job talk as an emotional journey so that people are invested in their success emotionally. That's a powerful leverage point and may be a differentiating point in the marketplace. I think I've understood your second question, and I'm going to answer it analogously. Okay. Anybody here ever read a book called To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee?
Yes.
Okay. On the first page of To Kill a Mockingbird, Scout Finch says, I'm going to tell you the story about how my brother Jem broke his arm. The narrative then disorients you for 215 pages. And in the last 5 pages, you find out that Jem broke his arm. So it answers the question that it sets up on the first page, but you completely forget that's the question that is driving the story for most of the story. Because the storytelling is so good, and you get invested in all going to Finch's Landing, and why is the aunt so mean and wants Scout to wear a dress, and what's going on with Boo Radley. All of that seems like it's a distraction, but every single thing adds up to answer the question, if any of these pieces were different, Jem wouldn't have broken his arm. And so that's the kind of thing of asking a rhetorical question and answering it at the end. When it's done artfully, you feel yourself carried along by the momentum of the ride, and you're glad for every distraction, because all of the distractions add up to answering the fundamental question. That's good storytelling. Yeah. Does that begin to touch on what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's such a good question you're asking, though. Yeah. Isn't this fun? Let's keep going. Yeah.
We have just a little bit over 10 minutes just to give it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
We
Go
have
ahead.
around 20, yeah.
I also have really enjoyed this, and I'm also doing history, and so with often very fragmentary sources. So the question is then, what does it mean, but also who cares, right? And I think that's your sort of audience question. So that's always the struggle, and I can translate that for the people in my fields. But the question is like, why would somebody who's going to buy something on Nassau Street, why would they care about what happened 1800 years ago in a place that they have never heard of?
Yeah.
Like how to do that, right?
Yeah. So Werner Herzog made a documentary about a man named Dieter, and then he made a fictional film about a man named Dieter called Little Dieter Needs to Fly. He told the same story 2 different ways to 2 different audiences. So you speaking in an academic context may not exhaust the material that you're mining. You may find a different way to arrange those materials for a different or a wider audience in a way that would be differently fascinating and ask different questions and answer those questions differently for that different audience. So I want you to think about your archival research, your historical narratives, not as a one-shot deal, but rather to be thinking about, and again, this gets into the fine grain of who am I speaking to? What am I hoping that they will do as a result of my speaking to them? And for fellow historians, you want them to engage and go deeper with the kind of research that you're doing. That may not be the thing that you hope for a more popular audience. And so sometimes the gaps that are there in your research, the things that aren't adding up, those will be communicated in one way to the audience of historians, and they'll be communicated in a different way to a more popular audience. For the historians, this becomes a place for more research to fill in the gaps, and you can name that. For a wider audience or a more popular audience, that may become the mystery that drives them to get the technical details. Why is Amiens Cathedral 144 feet high? Why is Beauvais Cathedral 144 feet high? And why are the 2 cathedrals different heights? That's an incredibly mysterious question. They're both 144 feet high, one is taller than the other. How does that happen? And in answering that question, you teach people about royal feet, Roman feet, and you teach people about scriptural exegesis in the Middle Ages. Okay, but you don't say, I'm going to teach you about Roman feet, royal feet, and scriptural exegesis in the Middle Ages. You ask a really provocative question. Amiens Cathedral, Beauvais Cathedral are both 144 feet high, and one is taller than the other. How is that possible? And now they're invested, they want to know. And you start out with that question, and you talk about all these other things that distract them, and at the end you answer the question, and they realize that they've gotten the original question answered, but they've learned so much more along the way. Now, I want to make sure that I've answered at least in part the question that you're asking. Do you want to ask a follow-on?
I think your thing of not just translating what I found for a wider audience, but presenting them with a different question was really helpful. Yeah, thank you.
You think people will just be interested, and they are interested, just by saying, just in in just, this thing was found and it looks like this.
Yeah.
Why does it look like that? I've never seen anything else. So all you need to do is contextualize it maybe in a case, we don't know why this looks this way, but then it turns out we figured this out.
So analogously, if you go to Hollywood, you don't sell scripts, you sell log lines. The best log line I've ever heard is The Wizard of Oz. A young girl travels to a strange land to commit murder and then teams up with strangers to kill again. Okay, that tells you what happens in the film, but it also intrigues you. Okay, so in Hollywood, you're always trying to find a way to distill the narrative down to the thing that will be the most evocative for the person because the person that its desk is coming across is a person with a limited attention span and a really good reason not to pay attention and to just pass it by, which sounds a lot like most of the audiences that we're talking to, including our students. Okay, so thinking in terms of how to distill down the kind of pieces of your research, your story, into the most evocative short sentence narratives. Think about it in terms of tweets, right? I have a colleague that has her students not write research papers, but rather write tweet threads. Because this is how you're going to reach audiences. Okay, so learning to write a good log line is a skill in and of itself. But learning a good log line will give enough information to create intrigue and a question that somebody wants to answer. How did that happen? I gotta watch that film. I gotta read that script to find out how this all plays out. And so that's what we're doing here, is we're trying to find ways, and again, I want to be very clear about this. The kind of work that we're doing is emotional manipulation. I used to say to my staff when we were producing television, if we're not manipulating our audience, we're not doing our job right. And that sounds really crass, but literally that, I was saying earlier in a conversation with the staff here at the center, in the early days of public radio versus commercial radio was designed to make money, and so they created a lot of aesthetics and standards that really kept the audience engaged. The early public radio was all educators at colleges like this, and when the first legislation about radio came out, most of the educator broadcasters lost their licenses because they couldn't meet the standards of audience that was there in the legislation. And so the educators had to learn from the commercial broadcasters how to tell stories, how to utilize the aesthetics of audience manipulation in order to keep them engaged in their stories as well. And the birth of public radio, NPR, is very much that learning from the commercial broadcasters in the nonprofit sector. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for this presentation.
My pleasure.
I'm
Yeah.
really compelled by your drive towards telling good stories, but I'm wondering how this connects to SEO and metadata and finding things online, because if, say, we start a story asking this, Amiens, these two cathedrals, same height, different heights.
Mm-hmm.
If that were to go in, say, a podcast description or website metadata, it's going to be difficult for people to find if they're wanting to know something about, say, Roman art, Gothic art. How do you make sure how do you balance those two factors of people finding the work, but also telling this creative story that maybe doesn't give away all the boring data at the front?
Okay, my answer to this is very cynical, and I apologize. I am old enough that I have been through several different technological revolutions. Excellent question that you're asking. I used to work for .com back before the .com bubble imploded, and one of the things that was my task as a content manager and information architect was search engine optimization. And my bosses came to me one day and they said, we want to be #1 on the keywords. And I said, what keywords? And they said, the keywords law, legal, and law school. And I had to tell them we're fighting against a noise floor of over 1 billion possible hits, and this was back in 1996. So one of the things about keywords, search engine optimization, that kind of stuff, is that the metadata oftentimes is not visible to the people who are there in the audience who are going to be interfacing with it. But making sure that those keywords, that metadata is well tuned in the background is essential. But I want to take apart what I take to be the assumption, which is if you have good keywords and good metadata, you're giving away the store of the mystery. I think you can have both because they live in different regions of how the public is going to access it. So when you're typing in the keyword search, the metadata is going to be working from that angle, I hope. And search engine optimization is not an area where I've intentionally not had expertise in that for over a decade. So I may be wrong, but my sense is that the keywords and the metadata can still be leveraged in a way that allows for an evocative title, a good log line to still ring out and sing out. And the people who I think would be best at this would be people who are currently studying library science, because they're having to think about how are we making this particular obscure piece of material available to wider audiences who are patronizing our library. How can we take and utilize the leveraging of the metadata and the leveraging of an evocative title into that? I hope that begins to answer your question, but I'm working from an expertise base that's more than 25 years old, and so I don't have a lot of direct answers, but it's a really good question. Yeah. Lauren, you're nodding. Does that mean that we're...
We still have 3 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as we say in my tradition, any burning desires? Yes?
How, at what point, if you're, say, pitching stories to national print outlets,
Yes.
how do we know by the fact that, so we're pitching the story and we're just getting ghosted, nobody's replying. How do we know whether this is because they don't like what the story is saying or this is a bad story?
That's a very good question. I'm going to answer the question in some detail because there's not one answer. In some cases, it's simply a numbers game. So my friend Steve Millies at Catholic Theological Union, he writes a lot of op-eds, but oftentimes he shops the op-eds to 3 or 4 different outlets before one of them picks it up. So sometimes it's simply, it doesn't work for our particular publication, and so you just keep churning. I know other people that do all of this through relationships that they have with certain editors. And so they can have frank conversations with the editors. What didn't work about this? What are you looking for? So for example, I write sometimes for Commonweal magazine. Griffin Olenek is a good friend of mine and he's an editor there. I can ask him, what do you need me to say? How do you need me to say it? How can I shape this so it fits what you're needing? Sometimes you get that kind of direct feedback. The people that reach the really high levels, they're doing a secret third thing. They have hired at multiple thousands of dollars brokers that work as middlemen in between that literally broker these deals for people like the New York Times and other things like that. So if you're over the transoming it to like Harper's Magazine, New York Times, things like that, the chances of your piece getting looked at without that kind of middleman approach, very small, unfortunately. It does happen every once in a while, but for the most part, the people who are placing these stories at the level that we're seeing it, there's a lot of financial stuff that you're not seeing that makes that happen to the tune of dozens of thousands of dollars per piece. And I say that as a person who at one point was caught up in that and was paying dozens of thousands of dollars to have some of my editorials placed, as back when I was out of academia. Now that I'm in academia and don't have access to those kind of resources anymore, I'm back in just I have to have relationships with people or I have to do the numbers game. So for most of us, that's what it's going to be. Yes, Susan.
Can I just really quickly jump in? Just to say, one of my close friends is a journalist and has said to me something that really stuck with me, which is that for making an academic argument that works, sometimes that antagonistic positioning is super useful. You want to say, like, I'm doing something new. I'm different from what all of you guys are already doing. If you're pitching a story to a journalistic outlet and you say, I'm doing something new, they're like, you're pitching to the wrong outlet. So that's also, just to say that sometimes in translating to a journalism mode, you need to find a good place for your story. That means that it can't diverge too far from what their general positioning is. Just a thought because it relates back to what we were talking about earlier.
So I've shared the deck with Lauren, so I don't know how it's distributed, but all these resources, the clickable links will be there and available.
Sure.
I have had so much fun. You guys have asked so many good questions, and I'm so grateful for your time and your thoughts. And if you ever want to talk to me again, cards are on the table. So,
I was gonna say, why don't people email you if they had the burning question, the good guy, the bad guy, or the obstacle, the not? Seriously, you could send them an email.
I would love to talk to you.
please do. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please help by grabbing your stuff. We're
I feel
under
like it really
strict
saved my
orders.
project because like I've read, it's unwritten, so theoretically,
Yeah.
but I need